On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Keith David Wattenpaw, your moderator for this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, but also recognize the many UC Davis students who accompany me this evening, part of our burgeoning program in human rights studies at... I hope so. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Thomas de Waal, who is a senior associate in Russia, in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment, who specializes in the South Caucasus region. He previously worked as an analyst and project manager on the conflicts in the South Caucasus for the London-based NGO Conciliation Resources and the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. He has also worked extensively as a journalist and a writer in the Caucasus and Black Sea region and in Russia, and has authored 2 books on Armenia, Black Garden, which is a fascinating read, and I read it the first time right before I went to Armenia, and it really helped open the history of Armenia for me in a way that I never expected. And finally, his most recent book, Great Catastrophe, which my advanced genocide students read and very much enjoyed, Thomas. It was a good read for us. So please join me in welcoming Thomas de Waal for a conversation about how the Armenian genocide has shaped contemporary politics, both within the Middle East and the Caucasus and beyond. Thomas de Waal. So I'll be asking, for the first half of tonight's proceedings, I'll be talking with Thomas about some of the issues raised in his book, but also issues relevant to contemporary Turkey and also the Caucasus region, both derived from his book, but also some very, very recent developments in the region. But first, I just wanted you to tell us about this remarkable visit you talk about in your book at the very beginning, where you are in the Kurdish city of Diyarbakir in southeastern Anatolia, and you visit this enormous church, St. Girgos. Can you tell us some about that visit and why it was so significant in helping shape your journey into this question?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you to the World Affairs Council for inviting me. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, San Francisco, for not being Boston, where I was on Tuesday. And it's great to be here. So let me just back up a little and say that as you mentioned, I studied the Caucasus for 20 years. I came to it as it were, from the Russian side, from being in the Soviet Union and in Russia and going to the Caucasus, going to Armenia. And I guess the metaphor I would use for the events of 1915, the killing of the Armenians, what became known later as the Armenian Genocide, was Mount Ararat. You're in Armenia, and sometimes the weather's bad or you're not noticing, but sometimes on a clear day you suddenly see this huge mountain filling the horizon, right. This incredibly high mountain, very, very beautiful. It's Mount Ararat. It's actually across the border in Turkey. And I kind of ignored, like most people kind of ignore Mount Ararat day to day, I kind of ignored the issue of 1915 and the genocide in the Caucasus. But eventually I kind of realized this is a huge historical issue which kind of overhangs everything. And my way into it was actually going to Turkey and discovering that obviously Turkey has this hidden history that most Turks don't know. And then I was invited by Bishop Barsamian, who's the Armenian bishop of the Eastern Diocese, who I'd got to know a bit. A very interesting man who'd grown up in Turkey, like a lot of Armenians lived all over the world, is now the Bishop of New York. And I was talking to him about how interesting changes were in Turkey, and he said, well, I'm leading this pilgrimage to Eastern Turkey. You should come along. And I said, well, I'm not an Armenian. He said, great, it doesn't matter, come along. So there were 72 Armenians from the Eastern Diocese and 2 non-Armenians, whom I was one. And it was an incredible 5 days, being with all these Armenians, going back to their homeland, which their grandparents or their great-grandparents had been deported from in terrible circumstances in 1915, to see the kind of connection they were making with the place, to see the warm reception they were getting from the locals. Many of them had been very afraid of going back to Turkey, all the implications that had. And lots and lots of moving experiences. All these stories came tumbling out. The whole issue became real for me, spending time with those Armenians. And the most moving thing was in this town of Diyarbakir, which is where I begin the book. So Diyarbakir is southeastern Turkish city, but it's basically Kurdish populated. It was the center of the war in the 1990s between the PKK and the Turkish state. And in the last few years, as Turkey has changed, these Kurdish groups have broken with the kind of mainstream Turkish narrative about what happened in the past, obviously to them, but not only to them, to the Armenians as well. The Kurdish party has issued an apology to the Armenians for what Kurds did to them in 1915. And most interestingly, there's this church, which 10 years ago was a complete ruin. There were kind of sheep grazing everywhere. And they've rebuilt this church. And they put their own money into it, the Kurdish municipality, and some Turkish Armenian businessmen as well. And they've not only restored it, but they've restored it as a working church. So suddenly we had the bishop saying the Armenian service on Turkish soil in this rebuilt Armenian church. It was actually September the 11th, which was a very appropriate day to have a requiem service. So he mentioned that a couple of lines in English. The rest was in Armenia, remembering the Armenian dead. And for me, and the Kurdish mayor actually welcomed us at the door of the church and said, "Welcome, my brothers and sisters. Welcome back to your homeland." So this, I don't want to romanticize this moment too much because there's a lot of issues still. This is a very, very live and very contentious issue. But this was a really moving moment of welcoming back, of reconciliation, which I wanted to, and rediscovery of history, which I wanted to begin the book with.
Excellent. Now, you talk about history, and this, of course, is a book that spends a great deal of its time telling the story of 1915, but it also, I think one of the things that's important about it is it recognizes that the historiography, the study of the Armenian genocide, the events of 1915 have really changed. And, as we're talking about before, I was a graduate student in modern Middle East history at UCLA and in the 1990s, and we were very, very aggressively steered away from studying within mainstream Middle Eastern history the Armenian genocide. It wasn't mentioned in our textbooks, and even when we'd apply for grants from the federal government, we were encouraged not to mention it as a topic. And I know over the last few years, there's just been this remarkable explosion in recognition of it. I think culminated most recently by the award to Taner Akçam of the Best Book Prize by the Middle East Studies Association, something that would have been absolutely inconceivable, 5 years ago, if not 10 years ago. So I was wondering if you could address some of that change.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm not a historian. I'm a kind of, if you want to describe me, I'm a kind of analyst of the present, but also a historian of the present. I look back 20 or 30 years in what I write. So it's not my job to. I'm not the kind of person I don't read in the Ottoman archives, and I don't read in Armenian even. So I don't. But I think where I identified a niche here, a gap to be filled in the literature, was in the story of what's happened since, the story of the story. Over the last century, the story of how an atrocity happens and how it has cascading effects over the generations, both for Armenians and also for Turks and Kurds as well. And this is obviously a huge political issue right now. I mean, it's incredible. These events happened in 1915, but people are in the White House right now talking about how do we respond to that. But I don't think it wouldn't have been possible to write this 10 or 15 years ago because everything was so polarized, so politicized that it was hard to kind of grab onto anything. I think what's happened the last 10, 15 years is a group of historians have said, we're not Armenian, quote, historians or Turkish historians, we're historians, we're there to study what happened. And as you mentioned, Taner Akçam, there are some Turkish historians, some good Armenian historians. This story used to be kind of told outside history. I think Armenians told it as a terrible morality tale of the destruction of our nation, which somehow happened outside history, and the Turkish version was very, very weird. The Turkish version was a combination of this didn't happen, but they deserved it anyway. Right. And now we've got Turkish historians and Armenian historians telling the story, telling the whole context, telling how, I think, the really important role of the First World War, that this may not have happened had it not been for the First World War. So it wasn't an inevitable thing. It escalated very quickly as as Turkey entered the First World War. The Allied attacks on Turkey played a role. The deportations escalated the more the British, my nation, the French, the Russians attacked Turkey. So there was a certain horrible dynamic to it. And I think we're now getting the proper history being told of that. And of course that made my job a lot easier. I just needed to summarize that and kind of move forward.
So a great deal of the book looks at this dilemma of acknowledgement and denial, right? So I thought, just briefly, could you help us understand what Armenians, both in Armenia and the Armenian diaspora and so on, what acknowledgement are they, what do they seek to be acknowledged? And then also, what does the Turkish state deny?
Right.
And also, of course, the next question, especially on denial, is, what is your thinking about why denial persists in the face of overwhelming historical evidence?
Wow, that's a big question.
So you can start with the first one.
I mean, the first thing to say is we shouldn't talk about Armenians and Turks as a monolith. You talk to 100 different Armenians, and I probably have in this book probably more than 100 Armenians, and you get 100 different views on this. There's also, I think, a strong difference between Eastern Armenia, which was the Armenia which was part of the Russian Empire, which is now independent Armenia, which was spared most of this, although they had huge refugee flows, and which is now concentrated on building a state. And the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire, the Western Armenians who were affected by this, they were destroyed, their culture was destroyed, their grandparents were killed, they were deported. They're the people who then went to the Middle East, and most of them in the United States, maybe some of you here this evening, are the descendants of those people. So this is, for those people, this is the crucial story of their grandparents. It's a crucial element of their identity, and sort of repairing that or acknowledging that is very key. It's almost like you can't bury your grandparents until this is fixed. So there's different Armenian views there, and obviously my book tells how every generation actually treated this differently. The first couple of generations, they were too busy getting on with their lives to make this a public issue, and then it all got wrapped up in the Soviet Union, the Cold War. It was only the 60s and the 70s that really, with identity politics in general, that this started to become a main political issue. Now, when it comes to Turkey, I think it's important to say 1923, Turkey's had 10 years of total warfare in the Balkans, in the First World War, and Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, as he was then, founds the new Republic of Turkey on the principle of forgetting everything. He draws a line completely under everything. There's even he purifies the language. There's even a new script, Latin script. So any books written in the Ottoman script can no longer be read. He changes the names of the week. He changes the dress. He secularizes the country. So everything is forgotten. Everything that's happened even 10 years ago is suddenly forgotten. We're now looking forward. And so Turkey grows up in this state of forgetting, not just about the Armenians, but pretty much everything that happened before 1923. And there's actually only one book published on the Armenians in Turkey between 1930 and the 1970s, just one book. There's a very clever Turk, you probably know him, Halil Berktay, historian. He has this phrase that there's this kind of myth in Turkey of the Immaculate Conception of the Turkish state, that it was born in a virginal state without sin, out of nothing. And I think this is the problem. This denial it comes out of just a complete absence of any knowledge, and that's only changed in the last 10, 15 years. And the other element of that is, of course, the great powers, as we call them. I think there's a triangle relationship here. There's the Armenians, there's the Turk who get abused by the Turks, and there's the Turks who get abused by the great powers, the Russians and the British and the French. And the Armenians appeal to the great powers to help them, and therefore they become kind of accomplices in Turkish eyes of the great powers. And there's this kind of very negative dynamic that the Armenians are kind of victims, but they're also seen as fifth columnists, if you want.
Well, but what seems to me to be a little bit missing from that that analysis of Turkish history is that in contemporary Turkey, there is a kind of if you will, a kind of cultural memory of the Armenians, which is both among some Turks very positive, but to call someone an Armenian or to claim they have an Armenian grandparent is a real insult in contemporary Turkish society. And it's often hurled around the way, 100 years ago, Americans might have said, oh, well, you have an African-American in your ancestry or something, or you're a crypto-Jew or something. And so I think to sort of say that there's been this great act of forgetting doesn't recognize the fact that there is a kind of perennial vilification of the Armenian as the internal other alongside Greeks as well, that really plays a role in contemporary Turkish politics that hasn't been forgotten.
That's true, but I would say that's on the level of a cultural stereotype. I don't think the people who are cursing, saying you're an Armenian coward or whatever, many of them have not met an Armenian. An Armenian is an abstraction for them. I think Hrant Dink, who is, for me, a pivotal figure in this book. We can talk about him a bit if you want. He's the Armenian journalist who's also a Turkish citizen who kind of sees both sides and is a kind of catalyst for dialogue. He says, well, he said, unfortunately, he was assassinated, but he said, this society is defending the truth it knows. His point was that we can't just berate Turks for denial. We need to educate them, we need to talk to them, we need to persuade them. His point was that it's a general process of opening up Turkey in a dialogue about its history, in which the Armenians are an important part, but not the only part.
Then why, if that's that kind of benign message from Hrant Dink, then why was he killed?
Oh, he was killed because even that message was incredibly subversive, because he was confronting this myth of the purity of the Turkish state by even raising that issue. He wasn't very popular amongst many of the Armenian diaspora as well, I have to say, although clearly the real danger to him came from the Turkish state.
And one of the issues you raise in your book, which I've seen firsthand, is that there is a growing movement amongst elements of Turkish civil society that are really trying to embrace that message that Hrant Dink had of learning and educating and reaching out. And you give the example of the apology campaign, right, which I think is a very interesting example. And I know that over the last year or so, I've been working with groups to Turkish human rights organizations to organize commemorations and so on in Istanbul, which in the 90s would have been absolutely unthinkable. And and I'm looking forward to being in Istanbul on the 24th to commemorate the genocide with Turkish colleagues and so on. But you raised the signature campaign. I think it's a good example. There were 30,000 signatures, but the anti-apology campaign was 100 times larger. And so one wonders how, what is the process that we're hoping to see happen? Turkish civil society is embracing this, but the Turkish state continues to, very vigorously oppose recognition, but also the vilification of the international Armenian diaspora and so on by the Turkish state, talking about the Armenian lobby and these sorts of things in very vituperative terms, seems to be a disconnect between the Turkish state and its elite, and then this very, very encouraging sign from Turkish civil society.
Well, I would say there's a whole diversity of views across Turkey, which is a sign that it's becoming a more normal society, I guess, this diversity of opinion in Turkey. I think there was an opinion poll the other day which said 18% of Turks favor an apology to the Armenians. Now, you could say that's a small number, or you could say that's actually quite a large...
I actually would consider that a very major change.
Yeah. And so in urban centers in Istanbul and Ankara, people have embraced this topic. You can go into bookstores in Istanbul and see, take books off the shelf which have called, History of the Armenian Genocide written in Turkish. My book's going to be translated into Turkish, which is good. And then over here you've got the Kurds, who I think are actually absolutely critical here. I think that the Kurds are the kind of wedge. That there just simply aren't any Armenians left, or very few in Turkey, but the Kurds are the kind of wedge for raising all these issues. And as you say, you've got the old kind of conservative members of Turkish society who still resist this message. But I talk to people in the government, Turkish government, I talked to people in the department in the foreign ministry, which was founded as the kind of propaganda department against Armenian terrorism in the 1980s. And those people are now the same people who are setting up, who are coordinating with the Armenian bishop to organize services, who are coordinating about Armenian monuments, about schools. So a lot of change, maybe too slow for Armenians, but quite considerable given where Turkey was 10 years ago. I think there's still this visceral reaction against the word genocide, which I write about. But I think if you have a conversation which doesn't use the word genocide, you can actually go much further than you could 5 or 10 years ago with a lot of Turkish officials.
Okay, so with that in mind, I just want to bring it up to today. As you know, the April 24th, 2015 will be the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian Genocide that mostly commemorates the destruction of the elite of Armenian Istanbul society and then the beginning of the deportations in Anatolia. And it also overlaps with the Gallipoli campaign. And there is some sense that the Turkish government is trying to use the international commemoration of Gallipoli to eclipse any attempt to commemorate the Armenian Genocide.
Yeah, and I would actually agree with that. I was pretty disappointed to see that. I mean, last year, he was then Prime Minister, he's now President, Erdogan, released a statement of condolences to the... Now, it was... a lot of Armenians took it apart and said, well, this is a pretty weak message, and clearly it wasn't enough for many of them. But just the fact of a message of condolences from the head of the most important Turkish politician was very significant, I would say. If anything, it kind of changes the narrative. You can't really call Armenians traitors and enemies. You can't call people you're giving condolences to enemies or traitors. I mean, that's showing, it's understanding that they were victims. But it's definitely a step backwards to organize on the same day, April 24th, a kind of rival commemoration of the Gallipoli battle, while there's also the commemoration going on in Yerevan. So I do think that's unfortunate. All sorts of foreign dignitaries will be scratching their heads saying, can we go to both? What do we do?
Could you imagine, for example, like the Prime Minister of Australia attending a church service in Istanbul alongside a commemoration of the Battle of the Anzac Memorial?
Well, there will be on Taksim Square that evening. There will be a commemoration. So maybe some people can go to that. But it's unfortunate because I think it's setting up a false comparison between what was clearly a terrible military defeat in which lots of young men died, but you can't really compare that to the whole massive destruction of whole communities of Armenians, men, women, and children.
So one of the passages in your book that I thought made a series of very important points was President Obama's 2010 April 24th message, where he uses the word that you've translated as your title, Metzieren, which for Armenians either means the great catastrophe or the great crime. And one of the issues that was raised by my seminar students was, what happens if you translate it as catastrophe as opposed to great crime? And also, if you could just give us your sense of the broader meaning of what President Obama did in that moment.
Well, obviously, a lot of focus on that was, is he going to use the word genocide or not? And he'd promised to in the campaign, and he didn't. And of course, there's going to be a debate about that. And in a sense, he set himself up for that criticism. But I kind of want to suggest that this is a bigger issue than the word genocide, and also tell in the book the story about how the catastrophe became the genocide. Obviously, the word genocide obviously post-dated the events by 30 years. So I thought it was a very dignified statement by President Obama. He uses the Armenian phrase "Metzieren." It's an attempt to kind of like to talk about, if you're talking about the Holocaust, to talk about Shoah, to use the kind of Jewish word. Now, some people translate it as crime, as catastrophe, atrocity. for me, the biggest word is catastrophe. I mean, that's that kind of the all-encompassing word. It's more than just a crime. It's a catastrophe. One of my Turkish friends, Cengiz Aktar, describes this as a catastrophe for the whole of Anatolia, not just, even for those left behind, it was a catastrophe to lose the Armenians. So I think that was a good phrase. But unfortunately, we're stuck with the whole genocide debate, which I'm not saying is, I'm not saying it's not unimportant. I'm just saying I think it's unfortunate that the whole debate about what happened to the Armenians in 1915, what justice they're owed, has become so focused on the one word, genocide or not. And I think it's kind of made it into a rather legal, political debate, and the human side of it is often lost in that debate.
So at this point, we've been collecting questions from the audience, and I'll do my best to bring some of them in. If people do have other note cards and other questions, please do hand them to members of the World Affairs Council, and they will bring them forward to me. Many of these questions revolve around the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as you expect. I'm someone who, in my own work, is more focused on on Turkey and Western Armenia, and I'm going to now move this over to the area where you're really a world-recognized expert. So I'll start by just the first question, of course, is that yesterday, President Sargsyan of Armenia withdrew the protocols that had been negotiated between Armenia and Turkey with a great deal of help from the United States that were seen as a really important step forward. If you could just help us understand the history of the protocols and what, if any, meaning at this point the withdrawal of them has.
Yeah, I don't think the withdrawal of them had a huge meaning. I think it was more to do with domestic politics in Armenia. President Sargsyan is in the middle of a big domestic political fight in Armenia. Possibly he wanted the support of the Dashnak Satun party in parliament, and so I don't want to get too into the weeds of Armenian politics. But the protocols, as most of you know, in 2009, the foreign ministers of Armenia and Turkey, after many secret negotiations mediated by the Swiss, I kind of tell the story in my book. I talked to pretty much everyone who was involved in that process, the Armenians, the Turks, the Swiss, the Americans. In October 2009, they signed 2 protocols on normalizing relations between the states of Armenia and Turkey, which had failed to do that when Armenia became independent in 1991. And unfortunately, it was a brave effort, but unfortunately, there were elements on both sides that really wanted this to work, particularly in Armenia and in the Turkish foreign policy establishment. But there were also many spoilers. The biggest spoiler being Azerbaijan, which felt extremely nervous that it was being left out of this process, involved in a conflict with Armenia, and saw this as kind of the Turks doing something behind their back. I think in the long run this would actually have benefited Azerbaijan, but I can understand that they were nervous. Parts of the Turkish establishment also weren't particularly keen, and also many Armenians, particularly in the diaspora, who saw they're making this provision in the protocols for a sub-commission of historians. They saw that as something that they couldn't accept. So they got to Zurich. They were kind of dragged to the table, partly by Hillary Clinton and others. But then they signed the document, but already the kind of steam was running out of the process. It was supposed to be ratified by the 2 parliaments. It wasn't ratified. The Turks started bringing up Azerbaijan and the Karabakh conflict pretty much soon afterwards. And so it's just remained kind of sitting on the shelf in the 2 parliaments ever since. And then, as you say, this week, President Sargsyan in Armenia withdrew on the Armenian side from the Armenian parliament. As I say, more as because he's in a bit of a tight fix politically, and it seemed a useful thing to do, than it actually made any difference to the relations with Turkey.
So, I mean, I think let's stay on the Caucasus for a few minutes here. Recently, there's been fighting along the ceasefire line between Azerbaijan and the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. Can you give us a sense of where that conflict is now and what the future prospects are for any kind of unfreezing of that conflict? And also your sense that, how this continues to play out in Armenian-Turkish relations as well.
Well, I think this is, in fact, if you're in Armenia, this is a much bigger issue day to day in your life than Turkey, because this is the conflict over Karabakh, which was fought in the early 90s. The Armenians won the conflict in 1994, great losses on both sides. The Armenians taking hold of Karabakh, this Armenian majority province that had been in Soviet Azerbaijan, and also large areas of Azerbaijani territory around it. But the ceasefire is signed in 1994, and the ceasefire line is established, but it's two armies on either side sniping at each other, very unstable. Azerbaijan getting a lot richer because of oil wealth, a lot more confident in the last 5-10 years, and beginning to sort of shake that ceasefire more and more. And a particularly bad year last year, I think 72 people dying on the ceasefire line, and a very bad January as well. So a very worrying situation in which a very polarized politics between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which Turkey is kind of a bystander, but because of political, cultural ties is obviously much more on the Azerbaijani side. I think a conflict that people should be paying a lot more attention to, because it's really, 3 steps from an explosion, and then we'd have a whole new war in the South Caucasus, in which both Russia and Turkey would sort of end up being dragged in, because Russia has a military alliance with Armenia and Turkey with Azerbaijan.
So, if you could imagine a kind of peace process for Azerbaijan and Armenia over Karabakh, what would be the elements of that peace process?
Well, there actually is a peace process, and there's actually a perfectly good document being negotiated, which is they've actually done a very good job of drawing up a very clever document, meeting needs on both sides, deferring the status issue till a bit later, getting refugees home. The problem is not a process, it's a problem of a total lack of will and trust to deal with it, and the fact that this conflict has kind of consumed both nations in a very black and white way, that very, very little room for compromise.
Could Turkey play a positive role in trying to unfreeze the conflict?
It could, and it's a bit frustrating that it doesn't. I think Turkey wants a peaceful resolution of this conflict, but is kind of doesn't really have the knowledge, capacity, strategic wisdom. Also is kind of very closely tied to Azerbaijan, and so the Caucasus, as I've always said, is a region where the tail wags the dog, where the small nations are kind of manipulating the big nations rather than the other way around.
All right, so many of the questions want us to move back to the relationship between Armenians and Turks over the genocide, but I want to stay just for a little bit longer in the Caucasus, if we can, for a second. So currently, Armenia is going through a very interesting political process where the Tashnaq, or the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, seems to have been a party out of power for a very long time, and somehow they're being brought back into some kind of what's happening in Armenia that's bringing this really kind of defunct political party back into the political conversation. It seems to have been kept out of Armenian politics for the last almost over a decade, in fact.
Well, I think they've always been there. This is the Dashnaq is, I think, maybe the second oldest Armenian political party.
One of the oldest socialist parties.
Yeah, dating back to 1890. They ran Armenia from 1918 to 1920. They were the biggest party in exile. So you could ask why it's a bit of a surprise that they've been actually such a small party in Armenia the last 20 years. But yeah, they do seem to be having a bit of a swing voter in the current political crisis. But I don't think they're ever going to...
They're not going to come back.
We're not going to see, I think, the Dashnaq party ruling Armenia.
Okay. So many of these questions are sort of revolving around how the United States might play a positive role
Right.
in terms of helping with either Turkish acknowledgement or building better relations between Armenians and Turks and so on. And you do talk about perhaps you could talk some about early 2000 efforts, this effort led by the United States Institute of Peace. But also, what is Turkey's increasing strategic role, for example, in the war in Syria?
Right.
Today, there was an agreement signed between the United States and Turkey to train a further number of now not just anti-Assad forces, but anti-ISIS Syrian forces in Turkey. I mean, how does this strategic relationship between the United States and Turkey affect this larger question? But also, what is the possible positive role that the United States government, but also United States civil society could possibly play in this process?
Well, I mean, I think, and I live in Washington, I see it's, Washington is many different Washingtons, and clearly if you're in Washington, the Pentagon is the Turkey lobby because, Turkey is the second largest NATO military, and the strategic role they play in the Middle East, or maybe less so, it's been a bit more problematic. And the Congress is the Armenia lobby because of many Armenian-Americans, including in California, obviously, but not only California. And the White House and the State Department are caught somewhere in between, trying to mediate these different claims coming from different places. So I think the United States can play a useful role in trying to facilitate normalization between Armenia and Turkey. The Swiss started that process, but the United States took it up. Unfortunately, maybe could have done a better job, but it was a difficult process around the protocols. I think that really would be the game changer if the Armenia-Turkey border could open and those two societies could interact. It would be positive, very positive economically for Armenia to have that border open.
I mean, can you specify what would be really at stake for Armenia in opening the border with Turkey?
Well, I mean, it would suddenly mean that Armenia, we should have a map, but it's got 4 borders, 2 little ones at the top and bottom to Georgia and Iran, one with Azerbaijan, which is obviously a kind of war frontier, and then one to the west with Turkey. And if you open that border, suddenly you can trade the railways which are taking you to the Black Sea across to Europe. Much more trade is coming in and out. On a purely business level, Yerevan would become the kind of economic hub for Eastern Turkey. Big major companies could suddenly invest in Yerevan and trade in Eastern Turkey. So it would be very good for Armenia, and it would also kind of end this kind of siege mentality of Armenia. Suddenly, the idea that you have a normal relationship with Turkey kind of moves the Republic of Armenia out of that kind of 1915 siege state. So it would be a positive. I think there would be many bumps on the road. In the short term, it would be quite difficult in many ways. But I think in the long term, it really would transform.
And we're seeing a lot more sort of student exchanges and businessmen exchanges across that border, which I think are frankly very encouraging signs. But what is the possible role the United States and the American public could play in the process of either making it less of a problem, but even towards the direction of reconciliation?
Well, I mean, mediators mediate. They don't. It's up to the people themselves. You can only do so much. It's up to the people themselves to want to get together. I do think that more can be done for Armenia. I do think that I spend a lot of time in Armenia, and I see a great loss of a great outflow of talent there, which is very sad. Great emigration. If only a fraction of those talented Armenians could be employed on getting the economy working again, that would be incredibly useful, and maybe that's something that too many Armenian Americans, I think, treat Armenia as a bit of a nostalgia destination, and they go to the churches. But a bit more effort on agriculture, the economy, the high tech sector, that would really be helpful for the country.
Okay. So we'll move back now into Turkey and the history of the genocide and so on. And one very provocative question was asked, which was, what was the What was the motivation for Turkey's Kurds to break with the state narrative on denial and begin to sort of reach out and allow the rebuilding of the churches, but also be really welcoming to large numbers of Armenian tourists, American Armenian tourists who are traveling throughout southeastern Anatolia? I know that in the hometown of William Saroyan, they're going to name the library after him.
Right.
So the parts of Kurdistan seem to be really changing in their attitudes towards this idea. So what facilitated that Kurdish break?
Well, obviously it's political. I mean, which isn't to say it isn't genuine, but it's political. I mean, the Kurds have suffered enormously over the last century. There's a story which may and may not be true, but it's a nice kind of apocryphal story of it. Well, not nice, but it's an apocryphal story. Armenian bishop being led to his death in 1915 and saying to the Kurds, "We're the breakfast and you're going to be the lunch." And sure enough, 1920s, huge repression by the Turkish state against the Kurds, the banning of the language, banning even of the identity. And although of course Kurds were some of the chief, people who carried out the atrocities in 1915, not as a kind of collective level, but just individual Kurds were heavily involved. But clearly, if you're a Kurdish political party, you want to break with this kind of stranglehold, or the idea that it's Turkey for the Turks, and therefore you want to kind of see as allies other people from the old Ottoman past, whether they be Greeks or Armenians or Alevis or whoever, and you're kind of trying to create a new multicultural Turkey, and it's a very interesting process. I even was invited on the New Jersey to a dinner where the Kurdish mayor of Diyarbakir was invited by a group of Diyarbakir Armenians to a dinner on the banks of the Hudson in New Jersey, and they were singing songs together, and it was a great evening.
One of the stories you tell in your book is that of Fatih Çetin, the Turkish human rights lawyer, who later on in life discovers that her grandmother, whom she grew up calling Shahir, was in fact Hiranush, which is a good Armenian name. And it really highlights the fact that during the Armenian genocide, large numbers of Armenian girls and young women were trafficked and transferred to Turkish households. And she discovered, as many other contemporary Turks and many Kurds too, as well, that they have Armenian ancestry in the form of these trafficked and transferred both women and young men. Do you have a sense that is possibly part of the reconciliation process or the acknowledgement process, or is it something that is too taboo within contemporary Turkish society to really have much of an impact?
Well, I think this is a huge issue, and I think that book, probably My Grandmother by Fatih Çetin, probably did as much as sort of 10 political campaigns by lobbying groups to change Turkey. It sold out in a few days. It's an incredibly moving story of her talking to her grandmother revealing that she was actually Armenian, talking about the family she lost, talking about what she went through as a child. And then incredible stories, and then Fatih Çetin realized that she'd missed little hidden signals, that, for example, in the spring, she and some friends would get together and do baking, bake these little cakes, and then suddenly, light bulb moment, this was her and her grandmother and her Armenian friends baking Easter cakes around Easter. Yeah. So I think this is really a huge issue which demands a kind of whole new approach. Maybe many more people than we thought were left behind, children and women, Armenians, some of them violently abducted, raped, and absorbed into Turkish families or Kurdish families. Some of them, taken in out of charity, and then absorbed into these families, and then they kind of disappear into history. And then, but in this part of the world, everyone knows who your grandparents were. These memories are preserved, and now suddenly, last 10, 15 years, all these stories are coming out. In Diyarbakir, I met 3 people who had Muslim names, but they were coming to the church in Diyarbakir and rediscovering their Armenian identity. So this oral history, I think, process is one of the things which is changing Turkey. But then you're left with the question: who are these people? They don't speak Armenian mainly. They still, some of them still have Muslim names, so they feel Armenian. But how do they? How do we categorize them? Maybe we shouldn't be categorizing, but it's a big challenge.
So some of the questions now are sort of asking what's really at stake for Turkey in acknowledgement? And I think that the focus of the question is would Turkey see that it was facing some kind of reparations, right, or you talk about the very interesting historical moment when Stalin made a play for right, Eastern Anatolia, and it reminds me of the story when Khrushchev, or what is it, that there was a complaint by the Turkish foreign minister that the the SSR of Armenia had Mount Ararat on it, even though Mount Ararat right, isn't in Armenia. And the Soviet diplomat replied to the Turkish diplomat, well, you have the star and crescent on your flag. Right. So,
but you're not laying claim
yes,
to
but
this,
you're not claiming that to that. So, but what's at stake for Turkey in this? I mean, is it more than just, is it something that would be embarrassing internationally, or is there a real sort of monetary or territorial dimension to this?
I don't think there's a territorial dimension to it. I don't think anyone's going to be redrawing the boundaries of the middle. Well, maybe they are. Well, yes, but not those boundaries. Right. But I mean, plus, I mean, even in 1915, the Armenians they were a plurality in some of these places, but they weren't a majority. But I do. I mean, to quote Hrant Dink again, he had a very good aphorism. He said, "We Armenians and the Turks, we both have clinical conditions." He said, "For us Armenians, it's trauma, and for the Turks, it's paranoia." And I think that's very, very true. That the Turkish state was also founded on paranoia, the idea that the great powers are going to break us up. If you actually go into the Ataturk mausoleum in Ankara, you see the map of the Treaty of Sèvres. So it's in common with, you might be walking to an Armenian household with the same map, but right, for a different reason. So I think there's paranoia that somehow the great powers are still out to get us. I think there's pride about the genocide word, which somehow apparently compares our grandparents to Nazis. I think there's this thing about double standards. What about all the Muslims who, when a Muslim got slaughtered, it was never such a big deal as when a Christian got slaughtered. And I think there's the reparations issue. Now, it would probably take us an hour to go through all those list of concerns one by one. I personally see it very. I think it would be incredibly hard to kind of relitigate the whole of World War I. Clearly, there are Armenians who can name their house and say that house belonged to my grandfather, and they, in a sense, have a legitimate claim over it. But what if that house was then settled by a Turk who fled from Bulgaria and lost his house? So there's a kind of cascading and interlocking effect of the whole of World War I, where massive population displacements here and there. So I don't think that's very, very credible, but I may be wrong. I do think the Armenians have an indisputable claim to all the churches in Turkey, and that's an interesting issue, and maybe something can be done jointly about that. But paranoia would be my one-word answer.
So I want to switch a little bit more towards talking a little bit about the war in Syria and its possible impact on this relationship. Syria, of course, was the place where many of the Armenian refugees of the genocide fled and tried to reestablish their community, especially in the city of Aleppo. which has been
Well, first of all, we should say were massacred in 1916 in large numbers
Right.
in Deir Zur.
right, and that was where the killing fields were in Syria as well. But there is some sense that's coming out that Turkey was in part complicit in the attack on Kesap, in a small Armenian village right on the border, and so on. Is there a possible negative role in the sort of the radicalization that might be accompanying the war in Syria on relations between Muslims and non-Muslims more generally in the region? And could there be a specific role for, say, Armenians in Turkey because of the war in Syria?
Right. Well, you're probably the Middle East expert. You probably have a better answer to this than I do. I mean, clearly, it's been a complicated factor, shall we say? That Assad was a protector of the Christian minorities in Syria. Turkey supported the anti-Assad forces. Turkey also, for a while, opened its borders to all these jihadis going across into Syria to fight Assad, and destroying. It seems they've destroyed the Armenian memorial in Deir Zur, which is pretty awful if they have, where the killing fields were. So clearly, it's yet another complicating factor.
So I think we can just in the final few minutes we can sort of think about what you see as both a positive and negative role for the American Armenian diaspora in this broader issue as well. I mean, is there a positive role for the American Armenian diaspora in trying to facilitate reconciliation, or is it a hindrance to this larger process?
I mean, again, we can't really talk about the diaspora because it's thousands and hundreds of thousands of individuals, each of whom make a individual choice, I think. And also, I'm a bit hesitant about using the R word, the reconciliation word. I think we're not at that stage yet. I think we're at a stage of dialogue is the word. I think the important thing now is it's very possible to have a dialogue between Armenians and Turks, for Armenians now to go back to Turkey, to rediscover their roots and have conversations in Turkey, to go back to their, as I did with this group, be pretty well received and meet people in Turkey. And I think that's really important and really possible as it wasn't a few years ago. And I think that's a really very good process. But I think that's a process of dialogue. I think reconciliation is the end point of that process, and we're not there yet.
Okay. So, I mean, the next question though is that much of the organized Armenian diaspora politics really revolves around the attempt to get the United States government to recognize the genocide.
Right.
I would argue that the federal, multiple presidents of the United States have said that a terrible event has taken place. We recognize it. We would like to see it not happen again. But there seems to be this perennial demand that this recognition take place. And I'm wondering how you see that as a possible hindrance to these various processes that are taking place in
Right.
Turkey now.
Well, I mean, I can see why it happened, and I think certainly there was a period when maybe these kind of publicity campaigns had an effect of kind of putting the spotlight on Turkey. And I can see also a lot of the book is again about how the power of the word genocide. People want to use that word, and of course the word Raphael Lemkin, who devised the word, also used the Armenian case. So there's a sort of logic to it. But I would argue that to put all your focus on that is to miss the point. This has got to be worked out in Turkey and with Turkey, rather than kind of assailing Turkey from outside. And nowadays, I think that's more possible, as I said, than it was a few years ago. And there are actually Turks who now use the word genocide, talk about including, this is very interesting, Hasan Jamal, who was the grandson of one of the three young Turk leaders of 1915. He's written a book with Armenian genocide in the title. So, that seems to me the train that people should be on, that particular Turkish train.
you've written this marvelous book, and what I found it so great about it is how forward-looking it is. And I think part of your message is that history should not be this sort of terrible trap that prevents people from moving forward. But on the other hand, there are moments, I think, of that past that need to be remembered and commemorated. And I think survival of the Armenians needs to be celebrated as well in the face of such terrible circumstances. And so if you could sort of devise an ideal form of commemoration, what are the elements of this history that you think are the important ones that should be remembered and celebrated and contemplated? What would they be?
Well, I think you've put it pretty well. I mean, I think it's important to say, and when I was researching this book, I spent some time in the Library of Congress and talked to the Armenian librarian there, Levon Avdoyan, and he said, "Yeah, Armenian genocide. Yeah, I let others take care of that one. It's an important issue, but I try to remember that there are also 3,000 years of other Armenian history, and I try to work on that issue." And he said, "Don't forget there are 3,000. Armenians have been around for 3,000 years. Hopefully, we'll be around for another 3,000. We've got a lot of culture." So I think just to kind of that is the best testament to the people who died in the Armenian genocide. Not to hold up pictures of dead bodies, but to show pictures of the things they did, the poems they made, the buildings they made, the music they wrote, the schools they built. That to me is the testament. So anything that can, clearly you've got to honor the dead, and you do that on April the 24th, but maybe other days of the year that you're honoring the things that these remarkable Armenians have built over the centuries.
So what do you think are will the Turkish government seek to interfere with any of these commemorative processes?
No, I think that's the good news. I think it's a very much on Taksim Square on April 24th. There will be a big, in the center of Istanbul. There will be a big ceremony, and that's the city, as you mentioned, where the whole thing started in 1915.
Right. So, I mean, if you were to sort of project this forward another, say, 5 or 10 years, this process of dialogue and critical conversation, which you highlight, I mean, what would you see as the best possible outcome over a 5 or 10 year window?
Yeah. Well, I would hope in Turkey a few things. Renaming of street names, restoration of churches, rewriting of history books, a lot of history books, but school history books I think is an important thing. And then some kind of acknowledgement. I think it would be unrealistic to expect the Turkish government to use the genocide word, but to allow society to use it. I think that's the kind of, those are the sort of things we should be looking for. Now, whether we're going to get there, unfortunately, depends on a lot of issues that have absolutely nothing to do with the Armenian issues, Turkish politics and Middle Eastern politics.
Do you see the border between Armenia and Turkey opening in that period?
Unfortunately, I see that Azerbaijan as being having a pretty tight veto on that.
Okay. And so were Azerbaijan to go through a kind of reform period and democratize and so on, which is conceivably unlikely, but would that help in this process?
Of course it would help, and I mean, one would like, we would like to see a win-win for everybody here. We don't want to see anyone left out. Clearly.
And you don't see, for example, Putin trying to force a solution on Armenia and Azerbaijan?
I think Putin's a bit busy with other things at the moment.
I think so. So, and this brings us to the end of our program this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you in joining me in thanking Thomas de Waal again for this excellent discussion. And I thank the audience as well.